News of a quiet dispute inside a small sheriff's office suddenly exploded across headlines. Tommaso Cioni, a name few people outside the community once recognized, publicly challenged a statement made by Sheriff Nancy Guthrie. The response was swift, direct, and impossible to ignore. What began as a routine announcement quickly turned into a growing controversy about facts, responsibility, and public trust. As questions spread and pressure mounted, one issue stood at the center of it all. But why speak now? In many towns across the country, sheriff's offices release public statements almost every day. Most of them pass quietly. They appear on official websites, social media pages, or local news reports. They usually summarize an investigation, an arrest, or a community safety update. For most residents, these updates are simply part of the daily flow of information. But one statement from Sheriff Nancy Guthrie's office quickly proved to be different. It began as a routine announcement. The sheriff's department released a written statement explaining a situation that had recently taken place. The statement was meant to clarify events and provide the public with an official account. At first, it seemed straightforward. Sheriff Nancy Guthrie outlined the department's understanding of what had happened. The statement included details about the circumstances surrounding the situation and named a man connected to the case, Tommaso Cioni. For many readers, the name meant little at first. Local reporters picked up the statement and began sharing it in short news segments and online articles. Television anchors repeated the sheriff's words during evening broadcasts. Social media accounts for local news outlets posted the key points. Within hours, the information began spreading across the community. Residents who followed local news saw the name Tommaso Cioni appear again and again. The sheriff's office had placed him directly at the center of the situation described in the statement. At that moment, the story still seemed simple. Law enforcement had released an official version of events. The public received the information. Local media reported the details. But then something unusual started to happen. As the statement circulated online, readers began discussing it in comment sections and community forums. Some people accepted the information without question. Others began asking for more details. What exactly had happened? Why had the sheriff's office chosen to release the statement now? And who exactly was Tommaso Cioni? Soon, the discussion spread beyond traditional news reports. Social media users began sharing screenshots of the sheriff's statement. Some highlighted certain phrases. Others questioned parts of the explanation. The story slowly began to grow. Local bloggers and independent news pages reposted the statement, sometimes adding their own observations about the situation. Each repost reached new audiences. As more people saw the announcement, curiosity increased. People wanted to understand the full timeline. They searched for background information. They tried to piece together what might have happened before the sheriff's statement was released. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office remained firm in its message. The statement was presented as the official explanation. For a moment, it appeared that the story would end there. After all, law enforcement statements often close the door on speculation. Once officials release a clear account, the public usually accepts it as the final word. But this time, the story did not end. Behind the scenes, the man mentioned in the statement was watching everything unfold. Tommaso Cioni had suddenly found his name appearing across news reports and online discussions. People who had never heard of him were now reading about him. For someone who had lived outside the spotlight, it was an unexpected moment. Friends, acquaintances, and members of the community began reaching out to him. Some asked questions. Others simply wanted to know if the reports were accurate. At the same time, journalists started searching for information about him. Reporters often try to understand both sides of a developing story. As soon as Cioni's name appeared in the sheriff's statement, it became part of the public record. That meant attention, and attention brought pressure. Days earlier, Tommaso Cioni had been a private figure in the community. Now his name was connected to a public statement from the sheriff's office. The situation placed him in a difficult position. If he remained silent, the sheriff's statement would likely stand as the only version of events. News reports would continue repeating the department's explanation without challenge. But speaking out carried its own risks. Responding publicly to law enforcement could turn a small situation into a major controversy. Could also attract even more media attention. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Cioni might stay quiet. But the conversation online continued to grow. People debated the meaning of the sheriff's words. Some defended the department's actions. Others questioned the details. Each new discussion added fuel to the story. Then, suddenly, the silence broke. Instead of staying out of the spotlight, Tommaso Cioni released a response of his own. His message directly addressed the sheriff's statement. And in that response, he challenged parts of the official account. The moment his words became public, the situation changed completely. What had started as a single statement from a sheriff's office was no longer a one-sided story. Now there were two voices, two perspectives, two very different explanations of the same events. The quiet update that once seemed routine had suddenly become something much larger. Public dispute had begun. And as the community watched closely, one question began to echo through every conversation surrounding the case. Which version of the story was true? But Cioni's response would raise even more questions than the original statement. As the story continued spreading across news reports and social media posts, one question began appearing again and again. Who is Tommaso Cioni? Before the sheriff's statement was released, his name had rarely appeared in public conversations. He was not a public official. He was not a celebrity. He was not someone who regularly appeared in news headlines. For most people outside his immediate community, Tommaso Cioni was simply an unfamiliar name. But once the sheriff's office mentioned him directly in an official statement, curiosity grew quickly. Viewers watching local news broadcasts heard the name repeated. Online readers saw it written in article headlines. Social media users shared posts discussing the situation. Soon, many people wanted to know more. Local reporters began searching for background information. Journalists often try to build a clearer picture of the people connected to a developing story. That process quickly started with Tommaso Cioni. They looked into where he lived. They examined his connection to the community. They spoke with people who had known him for years. What they discovered painted the picture of someone who had lived a relatively quiet life. Tommaso Cioni was not known for seeking public attention. Friends described him as someone who preferred privacy over publicity. He lived and worked within the community like many other residents. People who knew him personally often described him as calm and reserved. He was someone who focused on everyday responsibilities rather than public recognition. For years, his life had moved forward without much notice from the outside world. Until the sheriff's statement changed everything. When the official announcement named him directly, it immediately connected him to a situation that was now being discussed across the community. For someone who had never been part of public controversy before, the sudden attention was intense. Neighbors began hearing about the situation through local news. Community members started discussing the case in local gathering places and online groups. At the same time, journalists continued searching for more details about Cioni's background. Reporters often try to understand not just the event itself, but also the people involved. They began asking simple questions. What was his role in the situation described by the sheriff? What had happened before the statement was released? And how did he react when he first saw his name appearing in the news? According to reports, Tommaso Cioni first learned about the sheriff's statement shortly after it began circulating publicly. Like many people in the community, he likely saw the reports spreading through news websites and social media. For a moment, the situation must have been difficult to process. Seeing one's name appear in an official law enforcement statement can immediately draw attention. It can also shape how people view the situation. As the sheriff's statement continued spreading online, Cioni faced a difficult choice. He could remain silent. Many people choose that path when faced with sudden public attention. Staying quiet sometimes allows the story to fade away. But there was another option. He could respond. Responding publicly would mean stepping into the spotlight. It would also mean directly challenging the narrative presented by the sheriff's office. That decision would carry serious consequences. Once a response becomes public, it often fuels even more interest in the story. Reporters begin examining both sides. The public begins comparing every detail. At first, it was unclear which path Tommaso Cioni would choose. Meanwhile, journalists continued reconstructing the timeline of events. They searched for clues about what had happened before the sheriff released the statement. Some reporters attempted to contact Cioni directly. Others spoke with people who had interacted with him recently. Everyone wanted to understand how the situation had unfolded. Days earlier, the story had been simple. The sheriff's office had released a statement. Local news reported it. But now the story had become more complex. There was a person at the center of it all. And that person had his own perspective. Then the moment arrived that changed the direction of the entire situation. Tommaso Cioni released a response. His message did not avoid the issue. Instead, it addressed the sheriff's statement directly. In his response, Cioni argued that certain details presented in the official account did not accurately represent what had taken place. Those words immediately captured attention. When someone publicly challenges a statement from law enforcement, people listen closely. News outlets quickly began reporting that Cioni had responded. His message spread across social media and local news platforms. Readers now had two pieces of information to consider. First, the original statement from Sheriff Nancy Guthrie's office. Second, Tommaso Cioni's response challenging parts of that statement. The moment he spoke publicly, the story changed. What had once been a simple report from law enforcement was no longer the only narrative available. Now there were two perspectives moving through the same story. And as both accounts circulated across news platforms and online discussions, the public began doing something inevitable. They started comparing every detail. And Cioni's words would soon force the public to compare two very different versions of the same story. Once Tommaso Cioni released his response, the story entered a completely new phase. Before that moment, the sheriff's office had been the only voice explaining the situation. Sheriff Nancy Guthrie's statement stood as the official account. News outlets repeated its details, and most readers accepted the information as fact. But Cioni's public message changed the balance. Now there were two versions of the same story. Sheriff Nancy Guthrie's statement continued to represent the official position of the department. It described the situation from the perspective of law enforcement and explained the events as the sheriff's office understood them. At the same time, Tommaso Cioni's response directly questioned parts of that explanation. He suggested that some of the details presented in the official statement were not accurate. According to his message, the situation had unfolded differently than what the public had been told. The moment those words became public, journalists immediately began examining both accounts. Local news reporters carefully reviewed the original statement from the sheriff's office. They also analyzed the message released by Cioni. Each sentence suddenly carried new importance. Where did the two stories match? And where did they begin to separate? In some areas, the details seemed similar. Both sides described certain moments in roughly the same way. But in other places, the accounts appeared very different. Those differences quickly caught the attention of reporters. Newsrooms began producing new segments focused entirely on comparing the two statements. Anchors read parts of the sheriff's announcement and then presented sections of Cioni's response. Viewers watching at home could see the contrast. The same event was now being described from two different perspectives. As these reports aired, the community began paying closer attention. Public trust in official information is often strong. When law enforcement releases a statement, many people assume the details have been carefully verified. But Cioni's willingness to challenge that statement introduced uncertainty. Suddenly, people were asking difficult questions. Had the sheriff's office misunderstood part of the situation? Or was Cioni attempting to defend himself from criticism by presenting his own version of events? Online discussions grew rapidly. Social media platforms filled with comments from people who had read both statements. Some users believed the sheriff's office had provided the most reliable explanation. Others felt that Cioni's response deserved serious consideration. Debates began appearing in community forums, comment sections, and discussion groups. Some residents argued that law enforcement agencies must always be transparent when communicating with the public. Others warned that a single response from an individual should not immediately override an official report. The situation quickly became a public conversation about credibility. Meanwhile, local journalists continued searching for more information. Reporters often try to confirm details by speaking with additional sources. In this case, that process became especially important. If two different accounts existed, then independent facts could help clarify the truth. Journalists began reviewing records connected to the case. They also attempted to speak with people who might have witnessed parts of the situation. Each new detail seemed to add another piece to the puzzle. But instead of resolving the dispute, the investigation sometimes created even more questions. Certain facts appeared to support parts of the sheriff's statement. At the same time, other information seemed to align with aspects of Cioni's response. The story was no longer simple. It had turned into a complex situation where every detail mattered. Even small differences in timing or wording became important. Reporters carefully analyzed when events occurred and how each side described them. Meanwhile, both the sheriff's office and Tommaso Cioni remained under growing public attention. Every new report about the case spread quickly across local media and online platforms. The story that had once seemed like a brief update from law enforcement had now become one of the most discussed topics in the community. Residents followed each development closely. Some hoped the truth would soon become clear. Others worried that the dispute might damage public trust. At the center of the conversation were two simple questions. Which account was accurate? And what had really happened behind the scenes? As the debate continued, pressure slowly increased on both sides. Each statement released by the sheriff's office was now examined carefully. Every word from Cioni's response was analyzed as well. Neither side could easily step away from the situation. The story had already grown too large. News outlets across the region began paying attention. What started as a local disagreement was now attracting wider interest. With that attention came scrutiny. Reporters asked tougher questions. Community members demanded clearer answers. Online discussions continued expanding beyond the town where the story began. And as the spotlight grew brighter, one thing became clear. The controversy was far from over. Because the growing attention soon forced both sides to face a level of scrutiny neither had expected. As the story continued spreading through news reports and social media, the situation slowly became more than a disagreement between two people. The community itself had now become part of the story. Residents across the area began discussing the conflict between Sheriff Nancy Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni. Conversations appeared everywhere. In local cafes, inside small businesses, at community events, and across neighborhood gatherings. The topic was difficult to avoid. For many people, the situation felt deeply personal. Sheriff's offices play a major role in small communities. They represent safety, order, and public protection. Residents often build strong trust with local law enforcement over many years. Because of that trust, any public disagreement involving a sheriff's office can quickly create concern. When Sheriff Nancy Guthrie released her statement, many residents initially accepted it without hesitation. Law enforcement announcements are usually viewed as reliable sources of information. But when Tommaso Cioni publicly challenged the statement, uncertainty entered the conversation. Suddenly, the community faced a difficult situation. Two different explanations now existed, and people had to decide which one they believed. Soon, discussions began appearing in public meetings and local forums. Some residents raised questions about the details presented in the sheriff's statement. Others defended the department and argued that law enforcement officers deserved public support. The issue slowly divided opinions. At a local town meeting, community members spoke openly about the situation. Some residents expressed concern about how quickly the story had grown. Others asked local officials whether more information would be released. The atmosphere during these discussions was serious but respectful. Many people understood that the issue involved both public trust and personal reputation. Meanwhile, online discussions continued expanding. Community Facebook groups and local message boards became active spaces for debate. Posts about the story often attracted hundreds of comments. Some users shared links to news articles covering the dispute. Others posted their own interpretations of the events. Supporters of the sheriff's office argued that official law enforcement statements are based on careful investigation. They believed the department had no reason to misrepresent the situation. At the same time, others believed that Tommaso Cioni's response deserved close attention. They argued that when someone challenges an official statement, the claims should be examined fairly. In their view, transparency and open discussion were important for maintaining public trust. These conversations sometimes grew intense, but they also reflected something important about the community. Residents cared deeply about the institutions that served them. Trust, once questioned, often leads to strong public dialogue. Meanwhile, local reporters continued working to uncover more information. Journalists began asking both sides for clarification. News organizations sent formal requests to the sheriff's office seeking additional details about the situation. In many cases, responses were careful and limited. Official statements often focused on confirming the department's original position without expanding too far beyond it. Law enforcement agencies sometimes avoid sharing too much information when situations remain under review. At the same time, reporters also attempted to contact Tommaso Cioni for further comments. Occasionally, brief statements appeared, repeating the core message of his response. In other moments, there was silence. That silence only added to the mystery surrounding the case. When information is limited, speculation often grows. Every small update quickly became news. Local television stations began running follow-up segments about the controversy. Newspapers published additional articles examining the community's reaction. Soon, the story reached audiences beyond the immediate town. Regional news outlets began covering the situation, describing it as a growing dispute between a citizen and a sheriff's office. The case attracted attention because it raised larger questions about transparency and accountability. Once regional media became involved, the story traveled even further. National blogs that focused on law enforcement oversight and public trust began writing about the situation. Their articles often explored the broader issue of how official statements are communicated to the public. For many readers outside the community, the dispute represented a larger conversation about transparency. Inside the town, however, the impact felt more immediate. Residents continued watching the story unfold in real time. Every development appeared in news notifications and social media posts. People wondered how the situation would eventually be resolved. Would the sheriff's office release more information? Would Tommaso Cioni present additional evidence supporting his claims? Or would the story slowly fade away without a clear conclusion? As days passed, one thing became certain. The pressure on both sides was growing. Public attention can be powerful. When a story reaches wide audiences, every detail becomes important. Statements are analyzed. Silence is questioned. And each new development carries weight. Both Sheriff Nancy Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni now stood at the center of a controversy that neither side could easily escape. The community watched carefully, waiting for the next piece of information that might clarify the truth. But just as the debate seemed to reach its peak, another unexpected development began to emerge. And just as the debate seemed to reach its peak, another development threatened to change the entire story. By this stage, the dispute between Tommaso Cioni and Sheriff Nancy Guthrie had grown far beyond its original moment. What began as a single statement from a sheriff's office had slowly transformed into a public controversy. News outlets continued covering the developments. Online discussions remained active, and the community followed each update closely. The situation was no longer just about a statement and a response. It had become a larger question about truth, accountability, and public trust. Many observers began asking the same question. What happens next? In situations like this, several paths are possible. Sometimes a dispute slowly fades as public attention moves on to other stories. But in other cases, growing attention can push the issue toward deeper investigation. At this point, many people were waiting to see if new information would emerge. One possibility involved the sheriff's office releasing additional details. Law enforcement departments sometimes provide follow-up statements to clarify earlier reports. These updates can include timelines, records, or explanations designed to strengthen the department's position. If Sheriff Nancy Guthrie's office chose that path, it could provide more context for the public. Additional information might answer questions that had appeared during the debate. At the same time, another possibility remained. Tommaso Cioni could choose to present further evidence supporting his response. His earlier message had already challenged parts of the sheriff's statement. But if he introduced new documents, witnesses, or additional explanations, the conversation could shift again. Both possibilities carried significant weight. Each new piece of information had the potential to reshape the narrative that had already captured so much attention. Meanwhile, some community leaders began suggesting another option. In situations involving public disagreement with law enforcement, outside review can sometimes play a role. Independent investigators or oversight bodies may examine the situation to determine whether official procedures were followed correctly. Such reviews are often requested when public trust becomes part of the discussion. For residents watching the story unfold, transparency had become a central concern. People wanted to know that the information they received was accurate and complete. Restoring confidence sometimes requires clear answers. However, the path forward was not simple. Both Sheriff Nancy Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni faced their own challenges as the story continued. For the sheriff's office, the situation involved protecting the credibility of the department. Law enforcement agencies rely heavily on public trust. Every official statement is expected to reflect careful investigation and accurate reporting. If doubts appear around those statements, maintaining confidence becomes even more important. Sheriff Guthrie therefore faced the responsibility of ensuring that the department's communication remained clear and reliable. At the same time, Tommaso Cioni faced a different challenge. His name had become part of a widely discussed controversy. For someone who had once lived outside public attention, the situation had suddenly placed his reputation under intense scrutiny. Defending his version of events had become essential. Every statement he made now carried public impact. Each response had the potential to influence how people viewed the entire story. Meanwhile, journalists continued watching closely. Reporters often remain focused on stories like this, especially when new developments could appear at any moment. Newsrooms monitored public records, followed statements from both sides, and stayed ready to report the next update. The coming weeks would likely play a major role in determining the future of the controversy. Several possibilities remained open. New documents could surface. Witnesses might come forward with additional information. Official announcements could clarify details that remained uncertain. Any one of these developments could change the direction of the story. Inside the community, many residents hoped for resolution. Public disagreements involving law enforcement often leave lasting questions if they are not fully addressed. People wanted clarity. They wanted to understand what had truly happened. Yet, for the moment, the situation remained unresolved. The statements had been made. The responses had been heard. The debate had reached far beyond the town where it began. But the full story had not yet been confirmed. Some controversies disappear quietly over time. Others lead to important discoveries that reshape public understanding. Which path the story would follow was still unclear. For now, both sides remained under public attention, and the community continued watching carefully for the next development. Because the final truth behind this dispute may still be waiting to surface. The dispute between Tommaso Cioni and Sheriff Nancy Guthrie began with a single statement. At first, it seemed like just another routine update from a sheriff's office. But as the story unfolded, it revealed how quickly public information can turn into a larger debate. Two different perspectives created questions that spread across the community and beyond. Residents, journalists, and observers all searched for clarity, hoping to understand what truly happened. In situations like this, the search for truth often takes time. New facts may appear, investigations may continue, and sometimes the final answers only emerge long after the headlines fade. For now, the story remains a powerful reminder of how important transparency and communication are when public trust is involved. And as the world continues watching, the final chapter of this story may still be ahead.